say to you, and how does one build on it? What can be done with it?
I think it's very important where the respective communities at, and of course that majority voice would be heard and would come into play here. However, I think it's equally important to understand that those of us, Israelis and Palestinians, who as we grope towards this two-state solution, and it's difficult, those of us who've said that this will require American engagement, when we do that, we're not asking for an act of charity on the part of the American administration, and we're not asking the administration to do it because the American Arab community and Jewish community support it, even though that's good. We're simply asking the US to act in their national self-interest. And it's a point that Aaron raised earlier. You look at the Iraq Study Group report, for instance. I don't think it's coincidental when you have such a high-powered, bipartisan committee of the wise, that they come together and they look at Iraq, and they, surprise, surprise, say that the region does not exist in a series of isolated bubbles. The issues are interconnected in ways that may not be obvious, but when you delve, you realize that they are. And so a third of that report, and right now everyone says, let's go back to Baker Hamilton. A third of those recommendations are that the US should get engaged actively again in resolving the Israeli-Arab conflict.
But one of the things that happens in American politics is that people play the Jewish community off against the rest of the polity. And I know from the perspective of an Arab American, they play it off against the Arab American community. Oh, we can't do that because we have to be worried about the Jewish community. But these numbers say that you basically could say the same thing to both communities and win both communities' votes. Why doesn't it happen, and what can you do? What can you do with these numbers to make a political force out of them? Can you make a political force out of them? Or are they just numbers, these are what people's attitudes are, but there's no power behind them?
Well, clearly there is the argument that says that what may be very wide in terms of majority support is rather shallow in terms of how that comes to expression. But I think the important thing that those who believe in this in the respective communities should be advocating is for an administration to get engaged, because that's where the American interest lies. And I think that what is implicit in the poll is that should an administration pursue that path, then maybe there'll be the occasional obstacle strewn in the path of the administration by one community or one organization or another. But ultimately, if a president, if the executive branch is set on a direction, then I think the communities will by and large fall into line behind that.
You speak glowingly of 1991 and clearly the pressure that came from Jim Baker and I guess the creativity, the creative genius of Baker, the way the table was designed and the flags and the no flags and the delegations put together, etc. A dynamic was put in place that inevitably resulted in Oslo. There wouldn't have been an Oslo if we hadn't broken the ice in that ground. And I wrote an article, I remember after Rabin won, I called it Baker's win. I mean, he created a different political dynamic in Israel by pushing this forward. What Daniel is suggesting is that what people in the Middle East suggest is that George Bush, Jim Baker saw America's national interest and acted on it. But there are others who say that there was a political price that they paid for it in terms of the negative hits that they got. Weigh out for me the politics and the policy issue as you saw it play out in the administrations you worked under.
Historical contingencies, or the game of historical contingencies, is a difficult one to play, but I would venture to say the following, that had two things been different between the period 1990 and now, you'd be looking at a very different Arab-Israeli piece of this. Number one, had, and again, this is not a Republican or Democratic agenda, had the president's father been reelected in November of '92, and had Rabin not been murdered in November of 1995, you would have had one agreement, in my judgment, either between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel, perhaps more likely, between Israel and the Syrians. I believe, and the book that I'm writing argues fairly, I think, in a compelling way, that domestic politics has been a drag and a constraint. And only when American presidents and their empowered secretaries of state drive the national interest paradigm, will domestic political constituencies follow? And I would argue they will follow. One additional point. There's a paradox here. I would argue to you that since 1991, we have failed to do the kind of consequential diplomacy that is required. We've failed to broker one agreement between 1991 and now that was actually implemented. The heyday of American diplomacy, ironically, came in the period 1973 to 1993, a period in which there were no direct negotiations between Arabs and Israelis. It's a chilling paradox. We moved from being a broker, never honest, by the way, but effective. We're not an honest broker. Our special relationship with Israel, which is the key to our viability in this negotiation, has to be special but not exclusive. And what happened in the 91 to now period, is that our special relationship, and Baker would be the first to tell you, it was his relationship with Shamir that delivered the Israelis to Madrid. Our special relationship with Israel has become an exclusive one. And when that happens, America cannot succeed in Arab-Israeli diplomacy. I don't think this is a question of domestic politics. Bill Clinton was the most popular Democratic president, pro-Israeli president ever, and George W. Bush is the most pro-Israeli Republican president. Again, it's bipartisan American national interests, and those who recognize it drive to success.
I want to get you out there into the conversation. You can call us if you're calling from overseas. It's 001-202-842-5056. If you're calling from here in the U.S., it's 1-800-528-2090. I want to go to the folks who are here with us and see if there's anyone who has a comment or a question that they want to ask of any of what you've heard so far. Anybody? Yeah. Can we get him a microphone? Sure.
I would like to point to the weakness, the political weakness of the governments in that area.
Yeah.
We have almost dysfunctional government in Israel, dysfunctional government in Lebanon, government under pressure, international pressure in Syria, aging government in Egypt, and so on. Do you think under these circumstances we are going to have a good peace?
Let me ask, I'm going to
agreement?
start with Gaith and then Danny because they've just come from there. And Aaron mentions in his article the issue of Rice and her newfound initiative to convene meetings between Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert. But there are those who argue that both are so weak at this point that the meetings may not be about anything because can they deliver? I want to ask you both whether or not you think that the way the Secretary is doing it works. Are the governments there too weak to act and take the decisions that they're asked to take?
I mean, first, actually, let me just comment on a point that Aaron made. I believe that any American engagement is positive engagement. And even though you said that during Clinton it was not effective, however, it kept a level of stability and a level of belief in a process. The biggest problem in the last 7 years is that there has been no engagement, and we've reached the situation that we've reached into. Now, are these meetings effective? By themselves, no, they're not effective. And it's not only a virtue or a problem of the Palestinians and the Israelis, but as the questioner said, it's a regional problem. You have regimes which are weak, which are under threat, and you have a volatile region, especially after the Iraq situation. And what we're seeing right now is the possibility for not peaceful transition in these regimes, but rather a violent transition. Now, this actually makes progress on the peace process more fundamental and more essential and more pressing, because that's what can buy you some level of stabilization in the region. That can buy us some time, not to go back to the business as usual in the past, but rather to give us the space that we need as Arab regimes to start opening up our political systems, to start making sure that any political dissent and any political opposition expresses itself politically, peacefully, not through violent means. So it is essential to restore some level of credibility. It's not enough to bring only Abbas and Olmert. It has to be a bigger regional issue. But the U.S. has to come in with a real diplomatic engagement. It's not enough to simply have the meetings. You have to do all the heavy lifting and automatic heavy lifting to make the meetings significant.